In a drought-stricken desert village, Mira, the rain seer's daughter, gathers dust in jars as symbols of her late father's promise that the sky will one day remember how to weep. Against despair, division, and storms, she becomes the last keeper of hope, faith, and renewal.
I know the desert by heart, though it offers no kindness and no mercy. Its endless stretches of cracked earth and brittle sand are my world, the place where I live and breathe. Where the sky has forgotten how to weep for so long that even the oldest among us cannot say when the last raindrop fell. They say the village is a shrine to memory, a place where faith clings to the hope of a promise made long ago. I am Mira, the daughter of Raint, the rain seer who once spoke of clouds and water as if they were old friends destined to return. Each morning, before the sun rises fully to scorch the land, I slip from our small hut, careful not to wake my mother Lena, whose gentle breathing is a tether to the life we still hold. I carry with me a slender glass jar, its surface scratched and dulled by years of handling. This jar is empty of water but full of meaning. I kneel at the edge of our village, where the sand is soft and fine, and I gently gather the dust of our homeland, the grains slipping like memories through my fingers into the jar's mouth. It is a quiet act, nearly invisible to the world, but to me, it is a prayer. My father taught me this ritual. He told me once, with eyes like wells of quiet conviction, that the jars would one day brim with rain, that the desert would bloom again, and that we must hold faith as tightly as we hold life. The dust carries the promise, Mira, he said softly, placing his weathered hand over mine. One day the sky will remember. The village watches with varying eyes. Some see me as a child clinging to foolish dreams. Others, those like Lina, understand the fragile hope I nurture. The drought has worn down many spirits, and the sun's merciless glare beats down on bones and souls alike. The well runs dry and the whispers of despair grow louder each day. Yet I carry my jars, each one a silent rebellion against the crushing silence of the sky. Today, as I collect dust beneath a pale blue sky, I notice the cracked earth beneath my knees, fissures like scars across the land. The wind stirs a faint tremor in the air, and for a moment, I imagine the soft patter of rain, the scent of wet soil, the coolness that once was. But the vision slips away like a dream upon waking, leaving only the dust and the jar in my hands. Returning home, I place the jar beside the others, a growing collection that transforms our humble hut into a gallery of hope. Each jar is a testament, a seed planted in glass. Lina watches me with a look that is both tender and wary. You hold on to a promise, she says quietly, and sometimes promises are the only things that keep us alive. Her words settle in my chest like a warm ember. I know the road ahead is long and uncertain. The village's faith is fragile, and the drought's grip tightens. But as night falls and the stars scatter cold light over the desert, I whisper my own prayer to the empty sky. For the jars, for my father's promise, for a future where the earth drinks deeply once more. And in that stillness a flicker of hope endures. The sun had not yet risen when I slipped quietly from our hut. The coolness of the early morning a rare blessing in the relentless heat that would come. The village was still wrapped in slumber. Only the occasional crow's cry pierced the silence. I carried my jar carefully, knowing its weight was not just of glass and dust, but of dreams and memories. At the edge of the village, the vast desert stretched out, a sea of sand and cracked earth shimmering faintly under the first light. I knelt, the rough ground pressing against my palms, and began to gather the fine dust with reverence. The grains slipped through my fingers, falling like tiny whispers into the jar. Each jar was a promise, a silent prayer that the rain would remember us again. I thought of my father, Raint, his voice gentle as a breeze, his eyes full of hope, even when the skies were mercilessly clear. He taught me that faith is not just belief, but a living thing, nurtured by rituals and stories. Our village, though forgotten by the sky, was a sanctuary of memory and longing. The jars were our way of keeping the promise alive. The air was still except for the soft rustle of sand, and for a moment, I imagined the cool touch of rain, the scent of wet earth rising like a balm. But the desert had forgotten how to weep, and I was left with dust and glass, with hope wrapped in fragility. As I rose, the sun peeked over the horizon, casting a golden glow that made the dust sparkle like tiny stars. I clutched the jar to my chest, a fragile seed of belief carried in my hands. Returning to Lina's watchful eyes, I felt the weight of my promise, but also the strength that came from carrying it. This was just the beginning. The jars would fill, the rain would come. I believed it with all the quiet fierceness of a child who knows that hope is both a burden and a gift. In the heart of the desert, beneath a sky that had forgotten how to cry, I held on to the promise of rain. The desert sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the cracked earth of our village. I sat beneath the gnarled branches of the old acacia tree, its twisted limbs reaching out like weary hands begging the sky for mercy. In my lap rested one of the many jars I had filled not with water, for there was none to be found but with the fine dust of our land. Each grain a silent prayer, a fragment of the memory my father had entrusted to me. I closed my eyes and let the distant echoes of his voice wash over me. Rahim, my father, had been a man of gentle wisdom, his skin weathered by years spent under the merciless sun, his eyes always alight with a quiet conviction. He spoke often of rain not just as a falling blessing from the heavens, but as a symbol of renewal, of life reborn from the arid soil beneath our feet. I remembered how he would gather me close in the evenings, his voice soft and steady, weaving stories that danced like light on water. "The rain," he said once, his fingers tracing the rim of a jar like it held the very essence of hope, "is not gone forever. It sleeps beneath the clouds, waiting for the right moment to awaken. We must be patient, hold faith in our hearts, and when it comes, it will wash away the despair that has settled over us." But patience was a bitter draught to swallow in a village parched by years of drought. The people's faces, once bright with hope, had grown drawn and hard. Their eyes, like cracked wells, reflected a growing skepticism that settled like dust in their throats. The stories of rain felt more like distant echoes fading into silence. At the heart of this gathering storm of doubt stood Elder Kadir. I had seen him many times, his stooped frame moving with deliberate purpose, his sharp eyes scanning the village as if weighing its worth. He was once like my father, a young man full of dreams and faith. But the drought had carved lines of bitterness into his face, and his voice now carried the weight of harsh reality. I remembered the day he called the villagers to the square, the sun blazing overhead as murmurs swelled into uneasy whispers. His words cut through the heat like a whip. "We must accept what is," he declared. "The rain has forsaken us. Clinging to old promises only prolongs our suffering. It is time we face the truth and prepare for a life without water's mercy." His words unsettled even those who wished to hold on to hope. Some lowered their heads, others exchanged glances heavy with doubt. I felt the air thicken with despair, a fog that threatened to smother the fragile flame my father had lit within me. Returning home, I found Lina tending to the small hearth, the cracked clay stove barely managing a flicker of flame. Her hands moved with practiced grace, despite their wear and tear, as she prepared our meager meal. The silence between us was filled with unspoken fears and the weight of shared loss. Lina was both my anchor and my compass, pragmatic yet nurturing, her gentle eyes reflecting the same quiet hope that refused to fade. "Mira," she said softly, breaking the stillness, "your father believed in something greater, something beyond what we see. Hold on to that, but be strong. This drought tests us all." I nodded, feeling the fragile threads of our family's bond tighten around my heart like a protective cloak. That night, as twilight painted the sky in bruised purples and fading gold, I lit a small candle beside my collection of dust jars. The flickering flame cast dancing shadows upon the walls, each one a silent sentinel guarding the memories of rain and promise. I traced my fingers over the jars, imagining the day they would brim with water, that life-giving gift my father had sworn would return. Yet, even as I clung to hope, the shadows whispered doubts. Would the rain come again? Could faith alone sustain a village on the brink of despair? These questions hovered like ghosts in the cool night air, unanswered but persistent. In the quiet moments, I found strength in the memory of my father's voice and the stories that shaped my world. His promise was a fragile seed planted deep within me, nourished by every grain of dust I collected. No matter the growing storm of doubt, I would carry this legacy forward. For in the heart of the desert, where the sky had long forgotten to weep, hope was a stubborn thing, unyielding, flickering, and alive. And so I gathered the dust, the echoes of the past whispering in the wind, as I prepared to face the days to come. But even as the night deepened, I knew the dawn held trials yet unseen. The village was changing, and with it, the delicate balance between faith and reality was tipping. The question lingered, heavy in the air: how long could hope endure when the world around it crumbles? The answer, like the rain, remained just beyond reach. Yet I would not let go, not yet, and in the silence the desert waited with me. The morning sun had barely begun its slow crawl across the barren sky when I slipped out of our crumbling mud hut, clutching an empty jar in my hands. The air was thick and dry, every breath tasting of dust and forgotten rains. The village lay quiet, save for the soft rustle of wind stirring the cracked earth beneath my feet. This was my ritual, the careful gathering of the desert's dust, a silent prayer locked inside fragile glass. Each grain a testament to a promise my father had made long ago. I knelt beside a small crevice where the earth held its loose, fine sand like a treasure. My fingers moved with practiced care, scooping the dust into the jar, the grit whispering between my skin. The sun's heat beat down with relentless fury, distorting the horizon until the distant mountains wavered like a mirage. The ground beneath me was scorched and unyielding, a stark reminder of the drought's cruel reign. Yet, in this small act, I found a stubborn flicker of hope. Each jar was more than just dust. It was a vessel containing the memory of rain, a promise of renewal whispered by my father before he vanished into the endless desert. As the jar filled, I felt the weight of it settle in my hands, heavier than its contents should have been. The dust was dry and light, yet the burden of waiting the long years of silence from the sky pressed down like a stone on my heart. Still, I refused to surrender to despair. I sealed the jar carefully, wiping the sweat from my brow as I stood to face the village. The square was already stirring. A few villagers moved slowly between their homes, faces etched with exhaustion and resignation. Some passed me with suspicious glances, their eyes reflecting the deep weariness of souls worn thin by drought. I clung tightly to my jars, my silent rebellion against the creeping hopelessness. Elder Kadir was there, standing beneath the shade of a twisted acacia tree, his posture stooped but his eyes sharp and calculating. His face was a map of years hardened by drought and loss, every line speaking of battles fought in the name of survival. His gaze landed on me, cold and unyielding. "Mira," he called out, his voice cutting through the morning stillness like a dry wind. "Why do you persist with these foolish jars? Dust will not fill with rain just because you wish it so." I swallowed the lump rising in my throat but met his gaze steadily. "They are not just dust," I said softly. "They are hope." A murmur rose among the gathered villagers. Some nodded quietly, sharing my belief in the unseen promise. Others looked away, their faces shadowed by doubt. Elder Kadir's frown deepened. "Hope is a luxury we cannot afford," he said firmly. "We must face the truth. The rains have abandoned us, and clinging to empty promises will only hasten our ruin." His words hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the fragile faith I carried in my heart. I wanted to shout back, to tell him that faith could move mountains, that the jars held more than dust, they held the spirit of our people. But the weight of his pragmatism was daunting. Later, in the dim sanctuary of our hut, Lena found me seated among my collection of jars. Her soft features were touched with lines of worry, and her weathered hands trembled slightly as she reached out to brush a strand of hair from my face. "Mira," she said gently, "I see the fire in your eyes, but the world outside grows colder. We must be strong, not just in hope, but in reality." I looked up at her, the warmth in her gaze a balm against the chill of the village's doubt. "I know," I whispered. "But without hope, what are we?" She sighed, pulling me into a tentative embrace. "You carry a heavy burden, child. Your father's promise is a precious thing, but you must also carry the weight of our survival." Her words echoed in my mind long after she left, mingling with the dust that danced in the shafts of fading light. The jars surrounded me, silent witnesses to my stubborn faith. Each one held not just the earth's dust, but my defiance against the creeping despair that threatened to swallow us whole. As the day wore on, I moved through the village, the cracked earth crunching beneath my feet. I noticed the wary glances, the whispered doubts, the quiet fractures forming between neighbors. Elder Kada's words had struck deep, awakening fears that faith alone could not quell. Yet I clung to the ritual. Each evening, I added another jar to the collection, each one a silent prayer that the sky might yet remember how to weep. The task was small, but it was mine, a fragile act of rebellion against the drought's merciless grip. Night fell like a shroud, and I sat by the flickering light of a dying fire, the jars glinting faintly in the shadows. The village lay hushed, caught between the weight of dust and the promise of rain. My heart ached with the knowledge that the path ahead was uncertain, fraught with the dangers of lost hope and divided hearts. But still, I believed. For what was left if not the stubborn flicker of hope, held tight within fragile glass, waiting for a rain that might come beyond sight but never beyond belief? The desert night stretched endlessly, and I whispered into the darkness, "I will keep this promise, Father. I will not let it fade." And somewhere beyond the stars, I imagined the faintest stir of clouds, an unseen breath of life readying to return to the parched earth. The afternoon sun poured its relentless heat over the village, casting long, trembling shadows across the cracked earth. I stood near the edge, where the village met the barren desert, watching as Jamal's lean figure weaved through the dusty streets like a restless wind. His movements were quick, sharp, an energy that seemed almost foreign in this place where time had slowed to a wary crawl beneath the weight of drought. Jamal was the opposite of me in many ways. Where I gathered dust in jars, clinging to my father's promise like a fragile seed, Jamal seemed to reject such dreams outright. His eyes, dark and wild, held a restless defiance that both frightened and intrigued me. He was a stark reminder of the fractures within our village, the growing divide between those who still dared to hope and those who had surrendered to despair. We met where the cracked walls of an abandoned hut stood in silent witness to the years of drought. The wind tugged at my shawl, carrying grains of sand that settled on my skin like the memories of forgotten rain. Jamal's gaze pinned me in place, his voice low but sharp as he spoke. "Why do you waste your time with those jars, Mira?" he demanded, kicking at a stone until it skittered across the earth. "Dust won't bring rain. Your father's promises won't fill these empty wells." I swallowed hard, the words stinging like the dry air that scraped my throat. "It's not just dust," I whispered, holding up one of the jars. "It's hope. A reminder that rain once fell and that it can again." He shook his head, frustration clouding his eyes. "Hope won't feed us or quench our thirst. It's a luxury we can't afford, and what choice do we have?" I challenged, my voice steadier than I felt. "To give up and watch everything die." The tension between us was palpable, a fragile thread stretched thin in the heat. Jamal's defiance was fueled by pain, a bitterness born of too many broken promises and empty skies. Yet beneath that anger, I sensed a flicker of fear, the same fear that gnawed at my own heart. Later, I found comfort in Lena's quiet presence. Her home, though modest and worn, held a warmth that softened the harshness outside. She sat beside me, her weathered hands clasped in her lap, her gentle eyes reflecting a sorrow I knew well. "It's hard to hold on," she said softly, when the world around us seems to crumble. But we must, for the children, for the memory of what was. Her words wrapped around me like a fragile shield, a blend of realism tempered by love. Lina was the anchor that kept me steady when doubt threatened to sweep me away. The village council was a crucible of clashing wills. Elder Kadir, stooped and stern-faced, bore down on me with his sharp gaze. His words were blunt, slicing through the fragile hope I carried like a blade through dry grass. "Mira," he said, "we cannot live on promises and dust. The drought is our reality. Those who cling to old beliefs endanger us all." I met his eyes, unflinching. "And what do you suggest, Elder? That we surrender? That we let the dust bury everything?" His silence was heavy, the unspoken fears hanging between us like the oppressive heat. That day, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the village settled into uneasy quiet, I felt the weight of my faith more keenly than ever. The whispers of discontent were no longer distant murmurs, they were voices that challenged, questioned, and demanded that I choose. But choose what? To surrender to despair, or to nurture the fragile flame of hope that flickered stubbornly within me? The desert night stretched out, vast and silent, holding its own secrets and promises. And I, Mira, stood at the crossroads of belief and reality, knowing that the path ahead would test every grain of faith I possessed. I clutched my jars close, each one a testament to a promise that refused to die, even as the voices around me whispered otherwise. The wind stirred again, carrying with it the faintest hint of change, or perhaps just another whisper in the endless desert. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the cracked earth as I made my way toward old Seer Yara's hut. The village was quiet, the usual buzz of midday activity subdued under the weight of the relentless drought. I clutched a dust jar tightly in my hands, the fragile glass cool against my skin, heavy with the weight of the fine sand inside. Each grain was a silent prayer, a whisper of hope that the skies might one day open again. Yara's hut stood at the edge of the village, a small, weather-beaten structure that seemed almost swallowed by the desert itself. As I pushed open the rough wooden door, a wave of earthy scents washed over me, dried herbs, smoke, and the faint, lingering scent of rain from long ago. The interior was dim, lit only by the fading light filtering through small windows and the soft glow of a smoldering fire in the hearth. Yara sat cross-legged on a woven mat, her silver hair a halo around her deeply lined face. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, flicked up to meet mine with a mixture of curiosity and recognition. "You come with the jars," she said softly, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. I nodded, placing the jar carefully on the low wooden table between us. "These are not just dust," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "They are promises." She smiled faintly, a crease deepening near her mouth. "Promises, yes. But also stories." For hours, Yara spoke of rain spirits and ancient cycles, of the desert's whispered secrets that had been passed down through generations. She told me of a time when the sky was a living canvas, painted with the dance of clouds and the song of thunder. The jars I carried were not merely vessels of dust. They were vessels of memory, of faith that transcended the barren present. Her words wove a tapestry of myth and reality, blurring the lines until I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The dust in my jars was no longer just earth, it was the very essence of the stories that kept our village alive. But as I turned one jar in my hands, I noticed a thin crack running along its side. My breath caught. Yara's eyes followed mine, her expression grave yet tender. "Fragile," she murmured, "just like hope. But even the smallest crack lets light in." The thought settled deep within me. Hope was not a grand, unbreakable force, it was delicate, easily shattered, yet persistent. It flickered in the smallest things, a cracked jar, a whispered legend, a child's unwavering faith. When I stepped back into the village, the sun was a molten orb sinking beneath the dunes. The jars glinted faintly in the twilight, each one a testament to endurance. I felt the weight of their legacy, my father's promise echoing in every grain of dust. The journey ahead would be difficult, The cracks in the jars were warnings, reminders that faith must be nurtured, guarded against despair. But as I looked out over the barren horizon, I knew I would carry this legacy with me, no matter how fragile it seemed. For in the heart of the desert, where rain had long been forgotten, I found a seed of hope waiting to bloom. The night deepened, and with it, a quiet determination settled in my chest. I was no longer just a girl collecting dust. I was the keeper of stories, the bearer of promise, and the guardian of a hope that refused to be extinguished. And as the stars blinked awake in the vast sky above, I whispered a prayer not for rain, but for the strength to endure until it came. The jars would hold the dust, the stories, and the memories, and I would hold the faith, fragile yet unyielding, until the skies remembered how to weep once more. The desert sun cast a harsh, unrelenting light over the cracked earth as I sat outside our small home, the heat pressing down like an invisible weight. In my hands, I held one of the dust jars, a delicate vessel filled not with the water that our village so desperately needed, but with the dust of our homeland. I traced the rim gently, as if my fingers might coax a miracle from the brittle clay and the fine grains within. "Father," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath, "where have you gone?" The silence answered me, vast and empty as the sky above. It had been months since Father vanished into the desert, leaving behind only his promise that the rain would return. The memory of his voice, soft yet steady, echoed in my mind. He had been our beacon, fragile, yes, but luminous. Now, that light flickered in the emptiness left behind. Inside our home, the scent of dust mingled with the faint aroma of dried herbs. Lina moved quietly in the kitchen, her hands steady even as the trimmer in her fingers betrayed the weight she bore. She stirred a pot of thin stew, the simmering liquid the closest thing to nourishment we could muster. I watched her from the doorway, noticing the softness in her eyes, despite the wariness etched into her face. "Mira," she said gently, turning to face me, "your father was a man of great faith. He believed the rain would come because he believed in us, in the strength of this village, in the promise of the earth." I nodded, clutching the jar tighter. But why did he leave? Why did he go into the desert alone? Lina's gaze faltered, a shadow crossing her features. Sometimes when the world grows too heavy, people must walk into the silence to find their own answers. Your father's path is not ours to follow, but his hope remains in you, in all of us. Her words wrapped around me like a fragile shield. I wanted to believe them, to hold on to that flicker of hope despite the growing emptiness. But outside, the village stirred with unrest. Voices murmured in the square, some filled with sorrow, others edged with bitterness. I caught sight of Elder Kadir standing apart, his stooped figure casting a long shadow. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd, and when they met mine across the distance, I saw no warmth, only the cold certainty of his doubt. The villagers were divided. Some clung to the memories of Father's promises, others accepted the relentless drought-stricken fate. The weight of their gaze pressed down on me, a silent reminder that I was now the keeper of a legacy that many wished to forget. Night crept upon the village with a dusty wind that stirred the edges of the tents and whispered through the brittle branches of the dying trees. I climbed to the roof of our home, the rough tiles warm beneath my feet. The sky stretched wide and unyielding, barren of clouds of rain. I raised my eyes, searching the empty heavens, feeling the fragile seeds of hope grow stubbornly within my chest. "I will not let his promise die," I vowed to the silent stars. "I will gather the dust until the rain returns." The desert held its breath, and in that stillness, I felt the first stirrings of strength, not the strength of youth untested, but the quiet, enduring power of faith born from loss. The road ahead was uncertain and steeped in shadows, but I would walk it, carrying the jars, the memories, and the hope that one day, the sky would weep again. As dawn approached, the village remained wrapped in uneasy quiet, the weight of absence palpable. Yet within me, a fragile flame flickered, a promise that, even in the deepest drought, hope could take root and grow. The council house smelled of dust and dry wood, the air thick with the weight of unspoken fears. As I stepped inside, clutching one of my precious jars filled with the homeland's dust, the low murmur of voices swelled into a restless tide. Faces etched with hardship and worry turned towards me, some hopeful, others hardened by years of disappointment and drought. At the far end, Elder Kadir sat with a stooped posture that seemed carved by the relentless sun and the burden of years. His sharp eyes, cold and calculating, flicked towards me as I took my place before the gathered villagers. The room was dim, lit only by a few sputtering oil lamps whose flickering flames cast long shadows on the cracked walls. The air held a brittle tension, as if the very fabric of our community was stretched thin by the drought and the battles waging within our hearts. I felt my pulse quicken, the jar growing heavier in my hands, not from the dust inside, but from the weight of expectation pressing down on me. Elder Kadir rose slowly, his voice dry and resolute, like the cracked earth beneath our feet. "We must face the truth," he began, addressing the room with a grim authority. "The rains have not come for years, and there is no sign that they will return. Our crops fail, our wells run dry, and our children grow weak. It is time to abandon these futile hopes and accept the reality that this drought is our new existence." A hush fell over the crowd, the room filled with a silence so deep it seemed to swallow even the faint rustle of shifting feet. I could see the cracks in faces that once held faith, lines of worry deepening around eyes that had prayed too long. But I could not remain silent. Holding the jar close, I found my voice, soft but unwavering. "My father taught me that the rain will come again," I said, feeling the eyes of the villagers settle on me. "He promised that these jars, these grains of dust are not empty. They hold the memory of rain, the seed of hope. If we give up now, if we surrender to despair, then we lose not just the rain, but the spirit of our village." Murmurs spread through the crowd, some whispered words of encouragement, others scoffed or shook their heads. Elder Kadir's gaze sharpened as he responded, "Hope alone will not fill our wells or feed our children. We must be practical. We must prepare to survive this drought, not cling to promises that may never be fulfilled." Lina, sitting quietly near me, reached out beneath the rough wooden table to squeeze my hand, a small gesture that steadied my trembling. Her gentle eyes met mine, full of unspoken understanding and quiet strength. In that moment, I felt the fragile thread of our family's hope entwined with the fate of the village. Jamal stood at the side of the room, restless and tense. His gaze burned with frustration, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles whitened. His defiance was a sharp contrast to the wary acceptance in many faces. He paced in short bursts, his rebellious spirit a mirror to the conflict raging inside me. The council meeting stretched on, voices rising and falling like the shifting desert winds. Some villagers sided with Kadir, demanding a pragmatic approach to survival, while others clung to my words, yearning for a flicker of light in the relentless darkness. The rift between hope and despair was no longer hidden. It lay bare and raw. As the meeting drew to a close, I realized the enormity of the path before me. To carry my father's promise was to bear the weight of not only memory, but the fragile future of our people. The jars in my hands were more than vessels of dust. They were symbols of resistance against the silence of the sky. Walking home under a sky that held no stars, I felt the stirrings of a fierce determination. The road ahead was uncertain, the voices of doubt loud, but my hope, like the dust in my jars, was unyielding. I would not let the flame of belief be extinguished, no matter how dark the night or how harsh the wind. And so, beneath the endless stretch of barren sky, I whispered my vow once more, a quiet prayer carried on the desert breeze. The rain will come again. We must believe, or we will surely be lost. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows over the cracked earth, when I returned to the little clearing where I kept my jars. The wind had stilled, leaving the air heavy with dust and the sharp scent of dry leaves. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted a clean jar from the worn cloth that protected it from the relentless sun. Each jar was both a vessel and a prayer, a fragile promise caught in glass. I paused a moment, watching the reddish dust swirl softly inside before sealing it tight. This ritual was my rebellion against the silence of the sky, the stillness that had settled over our village for so long. Jommel was there, leaning against a battered wooden post. His eyes followed my every move, restless but attentive. "Still filling jars with dust?" he asked, his voice low but edged with a frustration I had come to expect. I met his gaze without flinching. "It's not just dust," I said softly. "It's memory. It's hope." He scoffed, but there was something behind his words that I couldn't quite place, perhaps a reluctant respect, or the ache of his own uncertainty. "Hope won't fill these jars with water," he muttered. "Maybe not today," I whispered, "but one day they will." Jommel shook his head, a flicker of bitterness crossing his sharp features. Yet, when the wind picked up again, scattering dust around us, he moved to help me cover the jars with a coarse cloth, his hands steady despite his words. Later, as the sky deepened to a bruised purple, I found Lina waiting in the doorway of our small home. Her soft features held the weight of years, but her eyes shone with a quiet strength. She motioned me inside, where the scent of dried herbs and warm bread offered a fragile comfort. "You were wearing yourself thin," she said gently, her hands folding mine in hers. "These jars, this hope, it's precious, but you must remember to live beyond them too." I nodded, feeling the familiar ache of responsibility settle heavier on my shoulders. Lina had been my anchor since father disappeared into the desert. Her balance of hope and realism was the thread that held our fragile family together. That night, I lay awake listening to the distant murmurs of the village, some prayers, some curses, all entwined in the harsh silence of drought. My collection of jars sat lined across the windowsill, catching the faint moonlight like a constellation of tiny stars. Each one held a flicker of belief, a defiant pulse against the creeping despair. I wondered how long that flicker could last. How long before even I might falter, swallowed by the dust and silence. But as the wind whispered through the cracked walls of our home, I pressed my hand to a jar, feeling the cold glass beneath my palm. "Not yet," I told the night. "Not yet." Outside, Jommel's footsteps faded into the darkness, carrying with them the restless spirit of our village, fragile, uncertain, but not yet broken. And so I continued, gathering dust, sealing hope, and holding fast to the promise that one day the jars would brim with rain. The horizon was no longer a distant line, but a swirling mass of ochre and dust, a heavy curtain creeping steadily towards our village. From the moment I noticed the sky darkening, a shiver of unease settled deep in my chest. The wind was changing. It carried the sharp tang of grit and the low, relentless whisper of a gathering storm. It was not rain, not yet, but something far more threatening. A sandstorm was coming. The village stirred with a mix of urgency and dread. Mothers called their children indoors, men hurried to reinforce walls and shutter windows. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth, and the sharp sound of hurried footsteps echoed beneath the darkening sky. I clutched my father's promise tightly, feeling the weight of it as I moved among my jars, each one a small sanctuary of dust from our homeland. They glinted faintly in the fading light, fragile and precious, as if they might shatter at the slightest breath. "Mira, come help me secure the shutters." Lina's voice broke through my thoughts, steady but edged with worry. Her hands, weathered yet gentle, moved with practiced efficiency, tying ropes and fitting wooden planks against the walls. I nodded, my fingers lingering on a jar shaped like a teardrop, the dust inside swirling gently with the rising wind. Outside, Elder Kadyr's voice rose above the growing clamor. "Order!" "Calm. We will face this storm with clear heads," he commanded, his sharp eyes scanning the gathering crowd. His presence was a stark reminder of the divisions beneath our fragile unity. He was the voice of pragmatism, insisting we prepare for survival, not for dreams of rain that had long since failed us. I saw him speak to the men, directing them to reinforce the granary and the well a grim task given the dryness that had withered both. His stern face was a mask of grim resolve, but I caught a flicker of something softer, a shadow of the hopeful youth he once was. Yet now, he seemed determined to snuff out the fragile sparks of hope that my father's legacy had kindled. Jamal appeared beside me, his lean frame tense, eyes burning with restless energy. "Why do you bother with these jars?" he asked, gesturing sharply to my collection. "They re just dust. The rain is never coming." His voice was harsh, but beneath it lay a desperate longing to believe otherwise. "They were not just dust," I said softly, meeting his gaze. "They hold the memory of rain, a promise my father made. And as long as I have them, I have hope." He scoffed but didn't move away. Instead, he offered a hand. "Let me help. Even if it's just dust, it's all we have left." Together, we moved quickly, securing the jars in the safest corner of my small home. Each one felt heavier than before, not with dust, but with the weight of expectation. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the relentless bite of sand. The village walls trembled under the storm's growing fury. Inside, Lena lit a small lamp, its flickering flame a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. "We must hold fast," she murmured, her eyes reflecting both fear and fierce determination. I nodded, feeling the pulse of my own resolve echo hers. The storm was a living thing, its breath hot and abrasive as it battered the village. The dust filled the air, stinging eyes and choking lungs, but it could not touch the steadfast hope cradled within these jars. As the night deepened, I sat amidst them, whispering promises and prayers, my voice barely audible over the storm's roar. What would become of us after this night? Would the jars survive? Would the village endure? These questions churned like the tempest outside, but I refused to let despair claim me. The storm on the horizon was not just a threat, it was a test, and I was ready to face it, for the sake of rain yet to come. As the first grains of sand slipped through the cracks in the door, I closed my eyes and imagined the sky weeping again, soft and life-giving. The storm raged on, but inside, a quiet flame burned, steady, a flicker of hope against the endless desert night. Outside, the village held its breath. Inside, I held my jars, and in the heart of the storm I found a fierce, fragile determination that would not be broken. The wind had finally stilled, leaving a thick, choking silence in its wake. The sun, a pale disk behind a veil of dust, cast a muted glow over the village, where the remnants of the sandstorm lay scattered like forgotten memories. Mira's feet crunched softly on the gritty earth as she made her way toward the small wooden shelf that held her collection of jars. Each one was a fragile vessel, heavy with dust and heavier still with the weight of promise. She approached slowly, heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. The air was still tinged with the scent of earth and sand, a raw, primal aroma that spoke of the desert's harsh embrace. Her eyes scanned the line of jars, each one shimmering faintly in the dim light, until they stopped abruptly on a single vessel. A thin, jagged crack marred its surface, a pale fracture that ran from rim to base. Dust fine and pale as the desert itself trickled slowly from the breach, scattering like fallen stars onto the ground. Mira's breath caught in her throat. The jar, one of the oldest, one that held the dust from the sacred grounds where her father had last stood, was broken. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, the fragile glass cool beneath her touch. She pressed lightly against the crack. The jar shuddered, threatened to shatter completely. Panic knotted inside her chest. How could this happen? How could something so precious be so vulnerable? The village, too, felt shattered in that moment, as if the cracked jar was a mirror reflecting the fragile state of their existence. The relentless drought had worn them down, sapping strength and spirit. The sandstorm was a cruel reminder that nature was indifferent to their prayers. At home, Lena was waiting. She noticed the dust clinging to Mira's clothes, the haunted look in her dark eyes. Without a word, she led Mira inside, where the air was cooler and the shadows deeper. Lina's hands, roughened by years of toil yet gentle as ever, carefully wiped the dust from Mira's scraped palms. "It's not just the jar that's cracked, is it?" Lina whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath. She sat beside Mira, pulling her close. "But hope is not so easily broken." Mira leaned into the warmth, the tenderness a balm against the storm raging inside her. She wanted to believe Lina, to cling to the fragile thread that tethered them to the promise of rain. But doubt gnawed like a silent predator. The next day, the village gathered for a council meeting beneath the great acacia tree, its skeletal branches reaching skyward like desperate hands. Elder Kadir stood at the center, his stooped form casting a long shadow. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, fixed on Mira as she stepped forward, clutching the cracked jar carefully. "This jar is broken," Kadir said, voice low but carrying the weight of finality. "Like the dreams of rain that once filled our hearts. We cannot build our lives on shattered promises." Mira's voice wavered but did not break. "The jar is cracked, yes. But it still holds the dust of our land, the memory of what was and what could be. My father taught me that hope is not the absence of hardship, but the courage to keep believing in spite of it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some nodding in quiet agreement, others casting wary looks toward Kadir. The rift between hope and pragmatism yawned wider, threatening to swallow the fragile unity the village had left. After the council, Mira retreated to the outskirts of the village, where the sky bruised with the colors of dusk. The cracked jar sat beside her, catching the dying light. Dust shimmered faintly within, a delicate glow that defied the damage. She traced the fracture with her finger, feeling the sharp edge beneath her skin. Her thoughts swirled like the winds that had just passed, a tempest of fear, loss, and stubborn hope. Could she carry this weight alone? Could the village survive the fractures in their faith? Yet in the stillness, a quiet flame flickered to life within her, a promise whispered on the desert breeze. She spoke softly to the jar, to the dust, to the memory of her father. "I will keep you safe. I will keep us safe. Even if the rain does not come tomorrow, it may come someday. And until then, I will hold this promise, cracked but unbroken, like my heart." Night deepened around her, but Mira did not move. The cracked jar was a wound, yes, but it was also a symbol, a testament to endurance, to the fragile beauty of hope in a barren world. And as the stars blinked awake in the endless sky, Mira made a silent vow to keep the faith alive, no matter the cost. The village meeting place, a once proud stone hall now cracked and weathered by years of drought and sandstorms, held a tense gathering under a sky that refused to weep. The air inside was thick with dust and unease, voices low but charged, as if the very walls absorbed the desperation of the crowd. I stood near the center, clutching my jar of dust, the weight of it, both comforting and heavy in my hands. The room smelled of dry earth and sweat, a scent that had become all too familiar. Faces circled around me, some hopeful, many wary, and others marked by a cold pragmatism that chilled my heart. Elder Kadir sat at the head of the council, his stooped form a silhouette against the cracked plaster wall. His sharp eyes scanned the room, settling finally on me. When he spoke, his voice was low but carried the authority of years hardened by drought and disappointment. "Mira," he began, his tone edged with a firmness that brooked no argument, "the time has come to face reality. This endless waiting, this clinging to promises of rain, it threatens the survival of our village. We cannot build our future on shadows and dust." I felt a tremor in my chest but steadied my breath. "Elder Kadir," I said softly, "the jars I carry are not just dust. They are the memory of our land, the faith we hold. My father believed in the return of rain, and so do I. If we surrender now, what remains for us?" A murmur rippled through the room. Some villagers nodded, eyes glimmering with a flicker of the hope I clung to. Others, hardened by years of loss, shifted uncomfortably, their doubt palpable. Kadir's gaze sharpened. "Faith is not enough, child. We must adapt or perish. The rains will not return in our lifetime. We have crops to save, water to ration. Your jars will not fill themselves." I swallowed the lump of fear rising in my throat, feeling the weight of his words like a scorching wind. Yet, beneath the surface, my resolve burned brighter. But without hope, what are we saving ourselves for? If we lose faith, we lose the will to endure. My father taught me that the desert only seems barren until it remembers how to weep again. The room fell silent, the tension thickening like the dust storms that swept through our village. Then, from the back, Jamal's voice cut sharply through the stillness. "Faith won't fill our bellies or mend our cracked homes," he said, his tone bitter and restless. He stepped forward, eyes blazing with frustration. "We talk of promises and memories, but what of action? We can't wait for rain that may never come. I say we find a way out, start anew elsewhere." Some villagers grumbled in agreement. Others shook their heads in dismay. Jamal's defiance was a crack in the fragile unity we had left. I looked at Jamal, seeing the fire in his eyes that mirrored my own, though fueled by anger instead of hope. "Running away won't save us," I replied quietly. "Leaving means abandoning those who still believe, those who need us to hold on." Lina, standing beside me, placed a steady hand on my shoulder. Her eyes, soft but resolute, met mine. She whispered, "Hold fast, Mira. They need your strength now more than ever." The council meeting stretched on, voices rising and falling like the desert winds outside. Arguments for pragmatism clashed with pleas for faith. The village seemed to fracture before my eyes, the bonds of community strained by fear and despair. When the meeting finally adjourned, I stepped outside into the cool twilight. The sky was a deep indigo, scattered with stars that watched silently over our broken village. Jamal lingered nearby, his jaw tight, the tension between us unspoken but heavy. "I want to believe," he said after a moment, voice rough with emotion. "But sometimes it feels like hope is a chain that keeps us trapped here, waiting for a miracle that won't come." I met his gaze, searching for the boy I had known before the drought hardened his heart. "Maybe hope is a chain," I admitted softly, "but it's the only one strong enough to hold us together when everything else falls apart." He looked away, the fight in him not yet extinguished, but tempered by something quieter, more uncertain. That night, as I lay beneath the thin blanket of stars, I held my dust jar close. The cracked walls of the village felt more fragile than ever, but within me a stubborn flame flickered. I was no longer just a child collecting dust. I was the keeper of a promise older than the drought, a bearer of hope in a place that had almost forgotten how to dream. The road ahead was uncertain, the village divided and wounded, but I would not let despair win. For in the silent jars, in the dry earth beneath my feet, and in the quiet faith of those who still believed, there was a seed of something waiting to bloom again. And I would gather every grain until the rain returned, or until I could no longer hold the hope alone. As the first cool breeze of dawn stirred the desert air, I whispered a vow to the sky, to my father, and to the dust that cradled our future. We will endure, we will remember, and one day the rain will come. The desert's silence had grown thicker lately, an oppressive stillness that wrapped around the village like a suffocating shroud. Mira felt it in her bones as she walked the cracked earth, the dust swirling faintly at her feet despite the calm air. Each day the sky remained an unyielding expanse of pale, unbroken blue, a vast, merciless void that seemed to mock the prayers whispered beneath it. It was this silence that drove her feet towards the one place she believed might still hold answers, or at least the remnants of a faith older than any drought. The dwelling of old seer Yara. The path to Yara's hut was etched into the rocky hills outside the village. A narrow trail lined with brittle thorn bushes and scattered shards of pottery worn smooth by time. Mira's sandals crunched softly on the gravel as she approached, the sun sinking low behind distant dunes, casting a golden haze that blurred the horizon. The air was thick with dust, the faint scent of sage and dried earth rising from the cracked ground. Yara's hut was a humble structure, patched with sun-baked mud and weathered wood. Its crooked silhouette leaned slightly, as if bowing to the weight of years she had endured. Mira paused at the threshold, her heart beating with a mixture of reverence and uncertainty. The old woman's reputation was as much a part of village lore as the vanished Raints themselves, a keeper of secrets, a weaver of stories, a bridge between what was and what might be. Inside, the dim room was lit by a single flickering candle whose flame danced in the gentle draught. The walls were lined with shelves bearing ancient scrolls, brittle manuscripts, and countless jars filled with powders, herbs, and Mira's gaze lingered here, dust collected from the farthest reaches of the desert. The faint scent of dried lavender and myrrh filled the air, mingling with the musty odor of aged parchment. Old Seer Yara sat cross-legged on a woven mat, her stooped frame draped in faded robes the color of desert clay. Her eyes, clouded with age yet sharp and penetrating, regarded Mira with quiet curiosity. When she spoke, her voice was low and gravelly, each word deliberate as if drawn from the depths of memory itself. "You carry the weight of the past in those jars, child," she said, nodding toward Mira's bundle. "But the dust alone does not summon the rain. It is the remembering the ritual that stirs the sky's heart." Mira settled beside her, the rough mat prickling her sun-warmed skin. "But the sky is silent, Yara. The drought grows fiercer with each passing day. How can memory fight such emptiness?" The old seer's gaze drifted toward the small window, where the last light of day faded into shadows. "The sky's silence is a test, a long sleep from which it must awaken. It waits for those who will not forget." Yara reached out and placed a gnarled hand atop one of the jars. "These vessels you fill with dust, they are prayers, offerings to the memory of rain. Each grain a story, a longing, a promise. But to keep the faith alive, you must also carry the stories, the songs, the ceremonies, the sacred acts that bind us to the water that once was and may be again." Mira listened, the old woman's words weaving a tapestry of hope and history. She spoke of ancient rains and gods whose blessings had once turned barren earth into blossoming fields. She told of rituals long forgotten by many but preserved in the folds of Yara's memory, dances beneath the full moon, chants that called the clouds, the planting of sacred seeds in cracked earth. As the candle flickered, Mira felt a strange warmth rise within her chest, a fragile flame, kindled by the connection between past and present, belief and survival. The old seer's stories were not mere fables. They were the lifeblood of a people who refused to surrender to the desert's cruelty. When Mira finally rose to leave, the night had draped the village in a blanket of cool darkness. The stars above were hidden behind a veil of dust, and the sky was an unbroken void. She clutched her smallest dust jar tightly, its weight a tangible reminder of her promise and her burden. Outside, the desert breathed in silence. The wind whispered softly, lifting grains of sand that sparkled faintly in the moonlight. Mira stood still for a moment, feeling the vast emptiness around her and the steady beat of her own heart. "The sky may be silent," she whispered to the night, "but I will not be." The desert's silence was vast and deep, but within Mira, a quiet resolve was growing. She understood now that hope was not simply waiting for rain to fall, but nurturing the memory and ritual that would one day awaken the sky's forgotten song. The jars of dust were more than vessels, they were the threads that wove her family's faith into the fabric of the village's soul. As she walked back through the sleeping village, Mira glimpsed faint outlines of homes, their cracked walls bathed in silver light, and heard the distant, soft breathing of those who still clung to fragile dreams. The weight of the drought pressed heavy, but in the hush of night, she sensed the stirrings of something unseen, a flicker of life beneath the desert's quiet. Her footsteps echoed softly on the hard earth, a rhythm steady and sure. Mira was no longer just a child gathering dust. She was a keeper of memory, a bearer of hope, a small flame against the vast darkness, and as long as she breathed, the promise of rain would not be forgotten. The night had been suffocatingly still, the kind of silence that presses down like a heavy stone on the chest. I lay awake, listening to the faint scraping sounds, Beyond the thin walls of our hut, sounds that prickled at my skin like the whisper of a desert wind. It was Jamal. I knew it before I opened my eyes. He was moving, restless and desperate, moving with a purpose that frightened me. By the faint glow of the oil lamp outside, I slipped from my bed and crept toward the door. The village was sleeping, wrapped in the brittle quiet that drought had carved into every corner. I stepped outside, the cold desert air biting at my skin, and found Jamal crouched beside the granary, hastily stuffing a small bundle with meager belongings. His hands shook, betraying the calm he tried to hold. "Jamal," I whispered, my voice barely carrying in the stillness. He jumped, startled, turning sharply to face me. His dark eyes bore into mine, fierce and haunted. "Mira," he said, voice low and urgent, "I can't stay here anymore. I can't breathe in this place." The silence, the waiting, it's killing me. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "But what about the promise? The jars, the rain, we have to believe," Father said. He cut me off, running a hand through his tangled hair. "Father's promises are dust, Mira, just like these jars. No rain is coming. We were wasting our lives on shadows." His words were sharp, cruel in their honesty, but beneath them I sensed something more: fear, sorrow, a deep exhaustion born from years of watching hope wither. "Don't you see," I said, voice trembling, "if we give up now, then what are we? Just empty shells, like the cracked jars after the last storm. We have to hold on, for all of us." He looked away, his jaw clenched. "I'm not like you. I can't carry this weight." The wind began to stir, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and distant sun. The village lay behind us, still and fragile, but the desert stretched out ahead, endless, merciless. "Please, Jamal," I pleaded. "Don't go, we need you here. We need each other." His eyes softened for a fleeting moment, but the restlessness returned like a tide. "I have to find my own path," he said, turning toward the dunes. "Maybe beyond this emptiness there's something else." I reached out, grasping his arm. "Then come back to us. Don't let the silence swallow you whole." He hesitated, then shook free gently. "I'll try, but I can't promise anything." And with that, he vanished into the pale light of dawn, swallowed by the desert's vast embrace. I stood there long after he was gone, the weight of his absence pressing down on me. The jars, my silent prayers, felt heavier than ever. Yet beneath the a stubborn flame flickered. If Jamal could leave, then perhaps I had to be the one to stay, to carry the hope that refused to die. Morning came slow and dusty. I found Lina by the well, her hands folded in her lap, eyes distant but kind. She said nothing about Jamal's flight, but the sadness in her gaze spoke volumes. We shared a quiet understanding. Loss was a companion we both knew too well. That day the village felt fractured, the air thick with unspoken fears. Elder Kader's words echoed in my mind, his cold pragmatism a sharp contrast to the fragile dreams I guarded. But as the sun climbed higher, I gathered the jars, each one a testament to the promise that still lived within me. Jamal's escape was a crack in the village's fragile veneer, but it was not the end. It was a challenge, a reckoning. And I knew deep inside that the choice was mine. To surrender to the desert's silence, or to nurture the faint flicker of hope that might one day bring the rain back to our thirsty land. As night fell again, I sat among the jars, their dusty surfaces catching the pale moonlight. I whispered to them, to the memory of my father, to the spirit of the village, and to Jamal, wherever he might be. "Hold on," I said softly. "Hold on to hope." The desert wind answered with a mournful sigh, and I closed my eyes, willing the dawn to bring something new. A promise beyond sight, waiting just beyond the horizon. The morning air was cool, carrying a fragile promise of change that seemed almost out of place in a village so deeply entrenched in drought and despair. Mira woke before dawn, the soft rustle of linen, and the familiar creak of the wooden door stirring her from restless sleep. Outside, the desert sky was just beginning to lighten, pale streaks of pink and gold threading through the lingering night. The village was still, no children's laughter, no calls to labor, only the low murmur of wind sweeping across the cracked earth. She found Lina already awake, seated on the rough-hewn stone bench just outside their small home. The older woman's hands were wrapped around a chipped ceramic cup, breath rising in gentle puffs as she sipped the bitter herbal tea they had managed to prepare. Lina looked up as Mira approached, her eyes soft but tired, bearing the weight of countless seasons of drought and sorrow. "Did you sleep?" Lina asked quietly, her voice a warm balm against the cold morning. "Not well," Mira admitted, settling beside her. "I heard voices in the village last night." "Jomel's return has stirred unrest." Lina nodded, her gaze distant. "It is not easy for him or for any of us. The desert changes us all in ways we cannot always understand." Mira traced patterns in the dust with her fingers, the fine grains slipping through her hands like fragile memories. "I worry for him. For all of us. The village feels like it's unraveling. That is why we must hold fast," Lina said, her tone steady. "Not just to the hope your father gave us, but to each other. You are stronger than you know, Mira, and we will face this together." The words were simple, but they carried a deep certainty that anchored Mira's heart. She looked up to see the first hints of sunlight painting the horizon, a fragile glow that seemed to echo Lina's steady resolve. Later that day, the village square became a stage for the simmering tensions wrought by Jamal's absence and sudden return. The young man, lean and dust-streaked, appeared at the edge of the gathering crowd, his posture guarded yet defiant. Murmurs rippled through the villagers, some curious, others wary, and a few openly hostile. Jamal's eyes scanned the faces around him, searching for recognition, for forgiveness, for a place to belong once again. The drought had carved deep lines of fear and frustration into the community, and his departure had been a wound that reopened with his arrival. Mira watched from a distance, feeling the weight of every whispered word and sidelong glance. She remembered the confrontation when he had fled his anger, his desperation to escape the suffocating hopelessness. Now, his return was a test not just for him, but for the fragile bonds that held the village together. As voices grew louder, Elder Kader stepped forward, his stern face shadowed by the midday sun. "We cannot afford distractions," he said sharply, his gaze locking onto Jamal's. "Our survival depends on unity and acceptance of our reality, not on chasing dreams that wither like the plants under this merciless sun." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some nodded in agreement, others averted their eyes. Mira felt a tightening in her chest, a mixture of fear and resolve. Stepping forward, she raised her voice, soft but clear. "We have known despair, yes," she said, "but we also have known hope. My father's promise is not just a dream, it is a calling. We carry it in these jars, in our stories, and in the strength we find in each other. We cannot let fear silence us." A hush fell, the tension hanging thick in the air. Lina stood beside Mira, a steady presence that lent the girl courage. Jamal's expression softened, a flicker of something like understanding passing between them. The day waned, but the echoes of that gathering lingered. Mira wandered through the village streets, her footsteps light on the cracked earth. She paused before the rows of dust jars, their delicate glass catching the golden light of the setting sun. Each jar was a testament of faith, of memory, of the promise that sustained them. In the solitude, Mira felt the weight of her responsibilities settle upon her shoulders. No longer just a child clutching at hope, she was becoming something more, a keeper of legacy, a bearer of light amidst the gathering shadows. As night fell, the village held its breath. The drought remained unbroken, the sky silent, but beneath the surface, a quiet stirring began. Bonds were tested, wounds exposed, and yet, through it all, the fragile flame of hope flickered stubbornly against the dark. Mira returned home to Lina's waiting embrace, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat a reminder that even the harshest desert could cradle life, and with it, the promise of rain yet to come. And so, as the stars blinked awake in the vast desert sky, Mira's journey continued, rooted in dust, sustained by memory, and driven by a hope that refused to fade. The gathering storm was visible long before it reached us. a churning mass of ochre and grey that blotted out the sun and drew a line between the brittle earth and the darkening sky. I stood at the edge of our village, the coarse sand shifting beneath my feet, the air thickening with the scent of dust and impending rain that never came. My heart hammered not just from the heat or the dry wind that sliced through the cracked ground, but from the weight of what was to come. Around me, the other villagers hurried, their movements sharp and hurried like the beating wings of frightened birds. Mothers gathered their children, fastening clothes and securing haphazard shelters. Men strapped bundles of wood and stone against the wind's rising roar. Yet beneath the surface of this frantic preparation lay a deeper tension, a simmering mixture of fear, frustration, and a fragile hope that I clung to with trembling fingers. Inside our humble home, Lina moved quietly but purposefully. Her hands, worn from years of toil and worry, worked at securing the small window shutters with strips of cloth and rope. The light inside flickered as the wind rattled the brittle walls and rattled the jars lined carefully on the shelf. Each jar held not water, but the fine dust of our village, my collection, my prayer, my rebellion against the relentless drought. They were fragile vessels, delicate and silent, yet to me they were the heartbeats of a promise my father had made long ago. Mira, Lina said softly, her voice steady even as her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. We must be ready. This one feels different. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I will protect the jars. She reached out, her fingers brushing my cheek in a rare moment of tenderness. And I will protect you. Outside, the wind rose to a howl, carrying with it the bitter taste of sand and the voices of the unsettled village. In the square, I saw Jamal, his lean frame silhouetted against the gathering storm. His eyes, sharp and restless, met mine for a brief moment before he turned and began a heated exchange with Elder Kadir. Their voices rose above the wind, a clash of raw emotion and hardened pragmatism. This storm will destroy everything. Kadir's voice was low but firm, his stern face set like stone. We cannot waste our strength on illusions. Jamal's reply was fiery, laced with the desperation of youth. Without hope, we are already dead. We must fight for what little we have left. The argument was more than words. It was the fracture line of our village's soul. Between the stoic elder and the defiant youth lay the future of our people, fragile as the jars of dust I guarded. As the first grains of sand whipped past my face, I gathered the jars into my arms, wrapping each one carefully in cloth. I traced the smooth glass with my fingers, feeling the coolness despite the heat, as if drawing strength from the dust within. The storm's roar grew louder, a relentless drumbeat that echoed the pounding of my heart. That night, as the village huddled in their homes, the wind battered our fragile shelters. The storm was merciless, a swirling tempest that seemed intent on erasing the last traces of life and hope from our battered land. Yet amid the chaos, I felt a quiet flame within me, a stubborn flicker of belief that these jars, these silent witnesses, would endure. I whispered a promise to the night sky, to the dust, to the memory of my father. I would not let his hope die. No matter the storm, no matter the silence of the sky, I would carry this legacy forward. For in the heart of the gathering storm, I found the strength to stand, to protect, and to believe. As dawn approached, the winds began to wane, leaving behind a battered but unbroken village. The jars, wrapped and guarded, remained intact, a fragile testament to the endurance of faith in the face of unrelenting despair. And as I looked out over the scarred earth, I knew that whatever came next, the spirit of our people, anchored by memory and hope, would not be so easily extinguished. But the question lingered, heavy as the dust on the wind: would this fragile unity be enough to weather the trials ahead? Or was our village destined to crumble beneath the weight of a sky that refused to weep? I held the jars close, feeling their weight, and vowed to face whatever came with the quiet courage of a girl who believed in rain though she had never seen it fall. The desert wind howled like a beast unleashed, whipping the sands into a frenzy that swallowed the village whole. Mira clutched a cracked jar to her chest, her fingers numb, her breath ragged as the storm's fury battered the fragile homes and shattered the brittle calm that had settled over the land for so long. The sky, long silent and indifferent, now roared with rage, a tempest that threatened to erase every memory of the gentle rains her father had promised. She stumbled through the choking haze, each step a battle against the suffocating swirl of dust and grit. The jars she had so meticulously collected, each a sacred testament to hope, clinked and rattled in her arms. Her heart pounded as she glimpsed the village square, transformed into a tumult of flapping cloth, splintering wood, and terrified faces pressed against the storm's relentless assault. "Mira! Hold fast." Lena's voice pierced the chaos, steady and strong. Mira turned, eyes searching through the sand-blind veil to see her mother struggling with a broken beam, her weathered hands steady despite the gale. Jamal appeared beside her, reckless and fierce, his eyes wild but determined, grasping a fallen jar and pressing it to his chest. The storm was a living thing, a cruel reminder of nature's indifference. It tore through the village's defenses, scattering the dust jars like fragile stars cast to the earth. Mira's heart shattered as she saw one jar break, the dust spilling out and mingling with the endless sand, hope dissolving into despair. Her knees buckled. She sank to the ground, the weight of loss crushing her spirit. In that moment, the storm seemed endless, the silence of the sky an echo of her father's absence. Tears blurred her vision, but amid the ruin, a quiet stillness settled the eye of the storm, a fragile bubble of calm. Closing her eyes, Mira breathed deeply, summoning the memory of her father's gentle voice, the warmth of his faith amidst the drought's harshness. "The rain will return," he had whispered, "not always in the way we expect. But it will come, carried by the seeds of belief we nurture." In the stillness, she felt something stir deep within, a flicker of light against the overwhelming dark. A resolve, fragile yet fierce, took root. She rose, the cracked jars pressed close, a guardian of memory amidst chaos. "We cannot let this be the end," she called out, voice steady despite the storm's roar. One by one, villagers emerged from the wreckage, drawn by her unwavering spirit. Elder Kader, stooped and grim, approached with wary eyes, his skepticism challenged by the flicker of hope in Mira's gaze. Together, they gathered what remained, the shattered jars and scattered dust, becoming symbols not of defeat, but of endurance. The storm would pass, the rain might not come today, but the legacy of belief, the fragile flame of hope, would not be extinguished. Mira stood against the swirling sands, a solitary figure framed by the storm's fury, her heart beating a stubborn rhythm of faith. The desert might be silent, the sky empty, but within her, the promise of rain lived on beyond sight, beyond fear, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The storm howled anew, but Mira's voice rose above it, a beacon in the tempest. "We endure, we believe, we wait." And in the eye of the storm, hope was reborn. The storm had passed, but it left behind a silence far heavier than the howling winds that had ripped through our village hours before. Dawn arrived cloaked in a dull gray light, as if the sky itself remained too wary to summon the sun's full warmth. I stepped outside my small shelter, the sand still swirling faintly in the air, settling like a shroud over every surface. Homes stood battered, their walls scarred by wind-blown shards of stone and dried wood. The gathering place where we once met was reduced to a skeleton of broken beams and scattered debris. My feet sank into the loose sand as I made my way through the village, each step a reminder of the fragile world we inhabited. My jars were my burden and my balm. I searched among the ruins for the containers I had so carefully collected, each one a silent prayer, a shard of hope encased in glass. Some lay shattered, their dusty contents spilled and mingling with the earth beneath. Others stood cracked, trembling like the delicate faith that held our village together. I knelt beside one such jar, the glass etched with fine fissures that caught the dim light. My fingers traced the fragile fractures, careful not to worsen the damage. "Father," I whispered, the name a soft echo in the vast emptiness. I will keep your promise alive. I will be the rain you dreamed of, the hope you planted in this dust. The wind caught my words and carried them away, scattering them like seeds across the barren land. Around me, the village began to stir. Figures emerged from broken doorways and crumbled shelters, faces smudged with dirt and lines etched deeper by exhaustion and sorrow. Lina appeared beside me, her eyes glassy with tears that she did not shed. She wrapped her arms around me, a silent offer of comfort that steadied my trembling heart. "We must gather the people," she said quietly. "They need to see that we are still here, that this is not an end but a beginning." Jamal came then, his lean frame silhouetted against the dim light. His intense gaze met mine, and in that moment, I saw not the restless youth who once challenged my faith, but a kindred spirit, scarred but unbroken. He nodded slowly, a silent promise to stand beside me. Together, we moved through the village, rallying those who would listen. The cracked jars became symbols not of defeat but of endurance, each one a testament to the resilience of our people. Elder Kader stood apart, his stern features softened by an unspoken respect as he watched the fragile stirrings of hope rekindle. The day stretched on, filled with the quiet sounds of rebuilding, the scraping of hands, clearing debris, murmurs of encouragement. The careful gathering of broken shards to be preserved as relics of what was endured. Though the sky remained obstinately dry, the spirit beneath it began to breathe anew. As night fell, I stood once more among my jars, their dusty contents shimmering under the pale moonlight. The storm had taken much from us, but it had not stolen our will to believe. And as the wind whispered through the shattered earth, I allowed myself a small, fierce hope that one day the rain would return, and when it did, these jars would fill and overflow, carrying the promise of renewal to every corner of our village. But until that day, I would keep watch. I would be the rain collector's daughter, the keeper of memory and hope, standing firm against the silence of the sky. This was not the end. It was the first breath of what might yet come. And so we wait, as the desert waits, holding its breath for a storm that may yet bring life. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows over the brittle earth of our village. The air was thick with the scent of dust and quiet longing, the very breath of the desert that had become both our home and our prison. I moved carefully among the scattered jars, their surfaces dull but unbroken, each one a fragile vessel holding not water, but the dust of our land, the memory of rain that had once kissed our thirsty soil. The jars were silent witnesses to our endurance, their fragile glass reflecting the fading light like muted stars fallen to earth. I knelt beside a jar with a small chip along its rim, tracing the crack with a finger as if by touch I could mend the fracture. This jar had survived the sandstorm, though barely. Like us, it bore the scars of hardship but refused to surrender. It was in moments like these I felt closest to my father, to the promises he had made beneath skies that no longer wept. His faith had been a flicker in the darkness, and now it was mine to carry. Lena's footsteps approached softly behind me. I did not turn immediately. Her presence was a balm, steady and sure. When I finally looked up, her weathered face held a quiet strength that I relied on more than I could say. She settled beside me, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. The touch was warm, a tether to the world beyond my swirling thoughts. "They are still here," she said softly, nodding to the jars. "Like us, holding on." I nodded, the weight of her words sinking deep. "I will keep them safe, Mama. I promise." Her eyes mirrored my resolve, but also the sorrow of a heart that had seen too much loss. "You are strong, Mira. Stronger than you know." Outside the small cluster of our home, Jamal's restless shadow moved near the village's edge. The wind lifted strands of his dark hair as he paced. The tension in his frame softened for a moment when our eyes met. His usual defiance was tempered by something new, a hesitant respect that had grown since the storm passed. He stopped, then approached with slow, measured steps. "You still believe," he said, voice low, almost uncertain. I met his gaze steadily. I have to. Without hope, what are we? He shrugged, a flicker of a smile ghosting his lips. Maybe you rewrite. Maybe there's something in those jars after all. The village square was stirring as well. Small groups gathered in the twilight, voices hushed but filled with a cautious optimism that felt foreign yet welcome. The air seemed to hum with the beginnings of something fragile, a shared will to rebuild, to reclaim what had been lost. I watched as Lina joined a circle of women, her words weaving comfort and strength, while elders and young alike exchanged tentative plans for the days ahead. The drought still clung to us like a shadow, but beneath it, a pulse of life stirred anew. As night fell, I returned to the jars, their outlines dark against the soft glow of lanterns. They held the dust of our past, the promise of our future. In their silence, I heard the whispered prayers of my father and the heartbeat of a village refusing to fade. I knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain, but with every jar I guarded, every story I passed on, I nurtured the fragile flame of hope. It was a gift and a burden, but one I would bear as long as breath filled my lungs. Because hope, like the rain, might not come when we wish, but it lives unseen, unfelt, yet unyielding, waiting for the moment it can fall again. The sun hung low over the village, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the cracked earth. I stood in the center of the dusty square, a place where so many moments of grief, hope, and debate had echoed through the years. Today I was to speak not as a child clutching jars of dust, but as a bearer of fragile hope, a bridge between the old promises and the harsh realities that had come to define our lives. The villagers gathered slowly, drawn by the word I had spread in whispers and cautious tidings. Some came with hardened faces, etched by years of drought and disappointment. Others bore the faint glimmer of lingering faith, eyes searching for something to hold onto in this endless desert of silence. At the edge of the crowd stood Elder Kadir, his stooped figure framed by the rising dust, his sharp eyes narrowing as they settled on me. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. "We have lived divided too long between those who still believe and those who have accepted what seems unchangeable. But I ask you, what harm is there in listening to one another, in sharing our fears and our hopes?" A hush fell, broken only by the soft whisper of the wind through the brittle branches of the few remaining trees. Elder Kadir stepped forward, his gait slow but determined. "You speak of bridges, girl," he said, his voice gravelly, "but the chasm between hope and despair is not so easily crossed. We must be practical. The sky has forgotten us, and we must learn to live with that truth." I met his gaze without flinching. And yet, was the memory of rain that kept us alive this long? The stories, the rituals, the jars of dust, these are not just relics. They are the threads that bind us to who we are and who we might become. Nearby, Lina watched silently, her gentle eyes flickering with a mix of pride and worry. She approached Jamal, who stood apart, arms crossed and jaw tight. The fire of his youth had not dimmed, but the weight of the village's suffering had carved lines of fatigue into his face. "Here," Lina said softly, pressing a small cup of water into his hands. "We all need something to hold on to." Jamal's gaze met hers, and for a moment, the restless defiance softened into acceptance. It was a small gesture, but in that parched land, even the smallest ripple could become a wave. Old Seer Yara shuffled forward next, her voice weaving through the crowd like a gentle breeze. "I have heard the legends of rain since I was a child," she began. "They live not just in our stories but in our hearts. We must remember that even the Dries Desert can bloom again, if we believe and work for it together." Elder Kadir's expression faltered, revealing a flicker of a past long buried. "I once dreamed beneath skies that wept," he confessed, his voice cracking with long-held sorrow. "But those days are gone, or so I feared. Perhaps there is strength in remembering, even if only to give us the courage to endure." The circle of villagers shifted, the rigid lines of division softening as shared memories and vulnerabilities surfaced. I felt the pulse of our collective heart fragile but alive. As twilight draped the village in hues of fading gold, Jamal and I walked side by side, the air cooling and the dust settling around us. "You re braver than I thought," he murmured, breaking the silence. "And you re more hopeful than you admit," I replied, a small smile touching my lips. "Maybe together we can build something new from these broken pieces." The desert night settled, vast and quiet, but beneath its stillness, a flicker of something like promise stirred. It was not the rain we longed for, not yet, but the beginning of a bridge woven from dust, memory, and the fragile threads of our shared humanity. I looked up at the stars, scattered like distant jars of light, and whispered the promise I carried within me, knowing that while the sky remained silent, our voices would not be. We will endure, we will believe, and one day the rain will come. The village was not whole, but tonight it was healing, and I was not alone. The square emptied slowly as the night deepened, the flickering lamps casting long shadows on cracked walls. I lingered a moment longer, feeling the cool desert air brush against my sun-warmed skin. The jars sat in my small hut, each one a silent testament to what had been and what might yet be. Tomorrow the work would continue gathering dust, tending the fragile bonds between people, and guarding the fragile flame of hope that refused to die. For in this land where the sky had forgotten how to weep, it was our faith, our stories, and our shared dreams that would keep the village alive until the first drop fell. And perhaps, beyond sight but not beyond belief, the promise of rain would be fulfilled. The night whispered its secrets as I closed my eyes, ready to face whatever dawn would bring. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the jagged horizon, casting long shadows over the cracked earth of our village. The air, heavy with the dry scent of dust and time, breathed a quiet stillness that seemed both fragile and eternal. Beneath the skeletal branches of the withered acacia tree that stood guard at the village's edge, I arranged the jars, each one a small universe of dust, a fragment of my father's promise, a shard of hope crystallized in glass. The children gathered around me, their eyes wide and shimmering with the thirst for stories that could carry them beyond the barren expanse of our reality. Their little feet kicked up soft clouds of sand as they settled into a circle, their faces a mosaic of dirt and wonder. I felt a tremor of something deep and sacred rise in my chest, the weight of legacy. The pulse of faith passed from one heart to another. "These jars," I began softly, my voice barely above the whisper of the wind, "hold the memory of rain. Not water, not yet, but the dust of our land, the breath of our home. My father told me that one day, when the sky remembers how to weep, these jars will fill not with dust, but with the life-giving rain." The children leaned closer, their eyes reflecting the amber glow of the dying sun. I told them of Rahim, the gentle man whose visions once stirred hope in every heart, whose hands shaped the jars that now sat before us like sacred relics. I spoke of the stories he shared, of rivers that danced and clouds that sang, of seeds that split the earth open with green. As I wove the tales, I saw Lena standing quietly at a distance, her weathered face softened by a rare smile. Her eyes held a quiet pride, tempered by the familiar ache of loss and the steady strength she lent to me each day. I remembered how she balanced the fragile flame of hope with the cold wind of reality, how her arms sheltered me when despair threatened to take root. The children asked questions, sometimes innocent, sometimes probing. "Why does the rain not come?" One whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf. "Will it ever return?" Another asked, clutching a small jar I had given her moments before. Each question was a fragile thread, an opening in the fabric of our drought-stricken lives. Old seer Yara approached then, her presence like a soft breath from the past. Draped in faded cloth and carrying the weight of countless seasons, she nodded as I spoke, her eyes reflecting the distant shimmer of ancient storms and forgotten rains. When I finished, she raised her hands in blessing, a quiet benediction that seemed to fold around us like a cloak of wind and memory. "The stories you carry, child," she murmured, are the roots that will hold this village when the storms return. Faith is not just in the falling of rain, but in the holding on to the promise it carries. Night fell slowly, the sky a velvet canvas dotted with trembling stars. The children held their jars close, their small hands warm against the cool glass. The lamps flickered, casting dancing shadows that mingled with the dust motes suspended in the air. In their eyes, I saw a flicker of light, fragile, yes, but unyielding. The legacy of the Raint seer was no longer mine alone to bear. It had become a shared breath between generations. I felt the pulse of our village beat anew beneath the silence of the sky. The drought remained unrelenting, but within the circle of children, beneath the ancient tree, hope was reborn. Tomorrow I would gather more jars, tell more stories, and hold tighter to the promise that had shaped my life. For as long as the dust remained, so too would the memory of rain, and with it, the unspoken vow that one day, the sky would break and the desert would bloom again. And in that moment, beneath the endless expanse of stars, I understood that legacy was not merely a gift from the past, it was the seed of every tomorrow we dared to imagine. The night deepened, but my heart was light. The jars glimmered softly in the darkness, silent sentinels of a faith that would not be forgotten. And as I watched the children drift toward their homes, clutching their precious vessels, I whispered a promise to the wind: we will wait, we will believe, and we will endure. The story was far from over. In the silence, in the dust, and in the fragile glass of our jars, the legacy of the Raint seer lived on an unbroken thread woven through the fabric of our lives, binding us to the hope that one day the sky would remember how to weep once more. With every word spoken, every jar passed from hand to hand, the village stirred slowly, tentatively toward a dawn shaped not by the certainty of rain, but by the unyielding spirit of those who choose to remember and to hope. And in that choosing, we became more than survivors of drought. We became keepers of a promise that no storm could erase. The legacy was ours to hold, fragile as the desert bloom, enduring as the stars above. And as I gathered the empty jars at day's end, I felt the quiet strength of my father's vision settle within me, a steady flame against the encroaching dark. The rain would come, not yet perhaps, but someday. And until then, we would wait with patience, with faith, and with stories that carried the promise of renewal in their every breath. The night embraced the village in its cool silence, but in my heart a new chapter had begun. The legacy of the Raint seer was alive, and with it, the hope of all who called this desert home. I stood beneath the stars, the jars at my feet shimmering faintly, and whispered into the vastness: we remember, we believe, the rain will return. And in that whispered vow, I found my strength for myself, for my village, and for the generations yet to come. The night held its breath, as if listening, as if waiting. The sun slipped behind the jagged horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and soft oranges that bled gently into the coming dusk. I sat by the cracked well, the edge of the ancient stone cool beneath my palms, fingers tracing the familiar rim of one of my dust jars. The glass was smooth and unyielding. The faint weight of the dry earth it held a stark reminder of what we lacked and what we still believed might come. Around me the village settled into a quiet rhythm, the day's harshness folding into a softer, more contemplative evening. Faces once etched with wariness now held a tentative calm, as if the very act of gathering here beneath the dimming sky was a balm against the relentless drought. The wind whispered low through the empty branches of twisted acacia trees, carrying with it the faint scent of dry leaves and distant earth warmed by the fading sun. Lina sat nearby, her weathered hands carefully stoking a small fire that sputtered and danced between the stones. The flames cast flickering shadows that played over her gentle features, softening the lines carved by years of hardship and quiet grief. Children nestled close, eyes wide as I began to speak, my voice steady but soft, weaving stories of rain and renewal, of my father's promises and the hope that had not yet with it in our hearts. He told me, I said, holding up one of the jars, that one day these would fill with the rain we've waited for. That the sky would open again, and life would return to our village. A hush fell over the crowd, broken only by the crackle of fire and the distant call of a night bird. Lena smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the flames and something deeper, a hope she rarely voiced but clearly held. I saw in her gaze the strength it took to carry both love and realism, to hold on to belief while preparing for the worst. Jamal approached then, his lean form moving with a restless energy that had marked him since childhood. His gaze was intense, flickering between skepticism and something softer, a reluctant acceptance. He stopped beside me, silent for a moment before speaking in a low voice. "You still believe, don't you? Even after everything?" I nodded, feeling the weight of his question settle like dust between us. "I have to. If I don't, then what are we left with?" He looked away, eyes scanning the darkening village as if searching for answers in the shadows. "Maybe it's time to find new ways to survive. Not just wait for something that might never come. But waiting is what keeps us alive," I whispered, "the hope that this drought isn't forever. That one day, the sky will remember how to cry for us again." From the edge of the gathering, Elder Kadir watched, his stooped figure outlined against the twilight. His eyes, sharp and calculating, held a hardness that had often felt like a wall between us. Yet tonight, as he observed the jars, the children, the flicker of belief that still burned despite the years of silence, there was a subtle shift, a grudging respect for the girl who refused to let the village's spirit die. The night deepened, and the fire's glow grew brighter against the encroaching dark. Stories continued, voices mingling with sighs of wind and the rustle of dry leaves. I felt, for the first time in many moons, that the village was not merely surviving but beginning to breathe again, fragile, yes, but alive. The jars on the dusty ledge caught the firelight, each one a silent testament to the endurance of hope. I looked out over the village, the people I loved, the land cracked and dry beneath the stars. The drought still held us in its merciless grasp, but the bonds of family and faith were weaving a new tapestry, one threaded with resilience and quiet courage. As the last embers glowed low, I whispered to the night, promising to carry this hope forward, to be the keeper of memory and promise. For in the darkness, even a flicker is enough to light the way. And so, as the village settled beneath the vast, silent sky, I understood that my journey was no longer one of innocence, but of purpose. The drought would test us still, but we would meet it not with despair, but with the steadfast flame of belief that, like the rain, might someday return beyond sight, but never beyond hope. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, forgiving glow across the village, bathing the cracked earth and weathered walls in hues of amber and gold. I stood in the midst of the courtyard, surrounded by the countless jars I had collected over the years, each one filled with the dust of our homeland, each one a fragile vessel of promise and memory. The glass caught the light, flickering like tiny stars caught in a web of desert longing. My fingers traced the smooth curves of a jar, the dust inside swirling softly, undisturbed yet full of silent stories. Around me, the village stirred, small movements that spoke of life persisting despite the drought's cruel grasp. Lina approached quietly, her footsteps light against the cracked stone. Her eyes, those gentle orbs that had borne so much grief, and yet never lost their warmth, met mine with a softness that reached deep into the ache I carried. She placed a steady hand on my shoulder, grounding me in the moment. "You have done well, Mira," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of years and the quiet strength of a mother's love. I nodded, feeling the years of sorrow and hope intertwining like the desert winds that shaped our lives. Not far away, Jamal emerged from the shadows of a crumbling wall. His lean frame was less restless now, the fierce intensity in his gaze tempered by a new, fragile calm. He stepped forward, offering a smile that was both tentative and genuine, a bridge between the skepticism that had once defined him and the hope I had nurtured in the face of despair. The villagers gathered slowly, drawn by the quiet gravity of the moment, their faces etched with lines of weariness, but also a flicker of something new, something reborn. Old seer Yara settled beneath the ancient acacia tree, its twisted branches reaching skyward like the hands of the faithful. Her voice rose softly in the cooling air, telling the tale of the rains that once were, of clouds that sang and skies that wept blessings upon the earth. Her words wove a tapestry of memory and faith, binding the present to the past, reminding us all that even in silence, the promise of renewal endures. The stars began to peek through the twilight, silent witnesses to our vigil. I stepped forward, addressing the crowd with a voice steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath. "These jars," I said, lifting one to catch the last light, "are more than dust and glass. They are the story of who we are, the memories of rain, the dreams of my father, and the hope that will not fade even when the skies refuse to weep. We cannot see the rain yet, but that does not mean it will not come. Our faith, our family, our community, they are the wells from which we will draw strength." A hush settled over us, thick and profound, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. Then, slowly, a murmur of assent rippled through the crowd. Hands reached out to touch the jars, to feel their cool surfaces, to connect with the promise they held. The village, broken but unyielding, began to stir with a quiet determination. Old fears softened, old wounds began to heal, and the fragile flame of hope flickered brighter than it had in years. As night embraced the desert, I lingered beside the jars, my heart a mix of sorrow and stubborn hope. The drought remained, the sky still silent, but I knew deep in the marrow of my bones that faith was not blindness, but courage. And in this courage, we found the strength to wait, to believe, and to endure until the day the skies would finally open and the rain would come again. The promise my father made was no longer his alone, it was ours. And though the rain remained beyond sight, it was not beyond hope. The jars stood like silent sentinels, guardians of a promise beyond time, beyond vision, beyond despair. And I, Mira, would keep their vigil, as long as breath and dust remained. The desert night wrapped around the village, cool and vast, cradling us in its ancient embrace. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the first whisper of wind stirred the branches, carrying with it the faintest scent of possibility. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in many seasons, the future felt like something we might dare to hold on to. And so, beneath the endless sky, the promise endured quiet, unyielding, and alive.